Well, like a couple of things to bear in mind. That what decides whether people make progress or not is culture. Values shape human progress. But how is culture impacted, influenced by leaders that they want to set the tone of culture? And leadership is about sacrificial giving of self for the advance of the common good of all. The late guru of personal effectiveness, Stephen R. Covey, will tell you that there are two things that must be present for there to be leadership. Knowledge. If you don't have knowledge, you cannot lead. Because you don't know where you're going to take the people, because you don't know. And a great deal of the problems that we go through in our economic life, for example, is just because people don't have knowledge. And knowledge is not book knowledge. I mean, running an economy is just like running a family. If it is not reasonable, or it's not common sense, something is wrong. So, knowledge, then a sense of service. A sense of service deals with the people coming to the conclusion that you care enough about them, that you are willing to sacrifice yourself for their sake. Not because you are a masochist, but because you get the gain of immortality. The real gain of leadership is legacy. So people who are passionate enough about their legacy, who want to be remembered after their body has become dust, and whose antecedents in terms of character, in terms of competence, in terms of courage, is there to be seen. These are the kinds of people who should step into positions of leadership. But in Nigeria, these are not the kind of people. I mean, if you think that we invested so much in worrying about corruption and what it does to us, and corruption becomes the mantra of the change that we sought in 2013, 2014. And we're all so excited that, okay, finally we've got a leadership that's going to focus on this corruption that is so debilitating and deal with it. Who are the people who turn out to run the government? Now let's be very honest, I have no information to call one person corrupt, another person not corrupt, because I don't have access. But at least public perception is that most of the people who consulted the government that was formed were considered the most corrupt people in public life in Nigeria. You just kill the group of people. They just give up, like, okay, this is not, why should we bother anymore? If the anti-corruption government is run mainly by people perceived to be corrupt, what's the point? So when you get there, you understand that leadership doesn't know what it is doing. Because where leadership knows what it's doing, whether the people are angels who are perceived to be corrupt, leave them alone because of that perception. Lest you create scandal. But when they become the heart of the government, because very soon you find people begin to stay on the streets, anti-corruption what? This is the most corrupt government we've ever had, and becomes the general perception. Then you can't act anymore. That's the problem that we've had to deal with.
Some historians they believe that Nigeria's political problem, or in terms of structure, can be traced back to the 1914 amalgamation, where the southern part of Nigeria was merged with the northern part to form one nation called Nigeria. Do you agree with this?
People can advance all kinds of theories about if this had not happened, things would have been like that. The truth is that the problem is a failure of leadership. The United States of America, melting pot, people came and still come today from every which place, and they managed to fuse into one. If we had the right kind of leaders, whether we come to it from point of view of let's recognize our differences and develop and collaborate. Or from the point of view of let's integrate, whichever one we finally choose, there is no pure nation. All modern nations are an amalgamation of people. Even the so-called pure Germany is full. I mean, when you see German football teams now, they have people who are really Ghanaian, who have, So to tell me that it's about purity of ethnicity, I personally believe in the shared humanity of all. And I think that if we just have reasonable leaders, people will be able to work together in a way that people forget. I give you for the example of the silliness of ethnic purity. In the Southeast, there is a tendency for people to say, you see these people, they're not pure Igbos, they're from rivers, they're from Delta or from there. I say, okay, who are the pure Igbos? The Obosi people, the Onitsha people, mainly Gala people who just came down the Niger. Whereas some people in the Delta actually came from places like Isu, Ngri to cross the Niger. So who is more pure, the Obosi person or the Ibuso person or the Asaba person? Who's more pure? So you see that all of that is just absolute nonsense. And that man should grow out of this. We are different, so that's what the problem is. No, we are not different. The real problem is that lazy politicians turn to things that can make us versus them the issue to use to seek advantage for their personal goals. That's what this nonsense is about. And so in that sense, I don't really get faced by the whole 1940 is the problem thing. My goal, by the way, is that we should have the whole of West Africa become one country. That's my own dream. Because that's how we have strength. And look at Germany. If you go through the history of these nation of nations, as pure as they pretend to be, we know how Germany emerged. Until the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, after the 30-year War. All of those dukedoms and princes of Europe fighting one another, they were all just people seeking territory. In terms of their purity, they'd all been mixing in different ways. Don't forget that if you look at the history of the evolution of humanity, outside from Africa, and some that drifted northwards, where they affected their capacity to produce pigmentation, and they became white, so to speak. So if we focus on our shared humanity and stop worrying about who brought who together, if we had really good leaders that focused on service to people, the humanity of those persons, we'll make a lot of progress.
Let's talk about economic issues now. How will you assess the handling of the economy under President Muhammadu Buhari's administration?
In my view, first of all, we've had challenges in the evolution of the Nigerian economy. We just stop in one place and say that is, we can bring in what has gone right or gone wrong during certain epochs. But we have to look at how our economy began to evolve. In the colonial times, cash crops were introduced into the area that is now Nigeria. Most of the cash crops are on the tips of Nigeria. They came from cocoa or rubber or whatever. And we built a certain agri-produce-based economy that was doing very well in the 50s. The colonials failed to invest in industrialization of Nigeria, or Africa for that matter, generally speaking. These were outposts from which to extract raw materials for the metropole. Still, it allowed the marketing boards of the various regions, which is how we organized back in those days, to build up significant reserves in England. When self-government came, 56, 57, Nigerian ministers began to be appointed, there was a rapid rush to industrialize Nigeria. And the basis for that rush was a competition between the regions. Two American scholars called Robert Elson and Howard Wolpe, in a book about modernization in Nigeria, referred to that phenomenon as competitive communalism, competing ethnic nationality groups, trying to see who would most bring progress to their people. And you saw how free education was considered a very important component of development, education. And the West went forward, free education. Zeke, when he went east from the West, tried to respond competitively, had his issues and challenges there because of the budget. He didn't make as much money as Western region, and how they overcame that through a certain philosophy that bred cooperation between the government, the communities, the missionaries, and all of that. All of these brought us into an era where very sadly, we had what I like to call a dangerous alchemy of soldiers and oil. Just as oil was becoming a major source of our revenues, soldiers took up power. What is peculiar about the military? Military is a command structure. Okay, so authority is dispersed, starting from the big general at the top to the colonels. So the big general at the top appoints a colonel to go and be a governor. He cannot question the general at the top. Whereas the Nigerian Economic Council under Balewa would have a meeting, and Prime Minister Balewa would make a presentation, and the premiers would say, we can't accept it. And they will fight for hours. One particular story I like to tell, Dr. Pastor Kibo told me, he was an economic advisor to the Prime Minister. At the point, they sent out the Secretary of Press and said, look, politicians sort this out. And after some time, they were called back in, and Balewa announced, for example, that they were going to build a steel mill in every region, which struck Kibo was impossible. So after the meeting, he went, Mr. Prime Minister, and Balewa said to him, Dr. Akibo, the powerful premiers have had their say, we will have our way. Mr. Prime Minister, what will be our way? Dr. Akibo, we will do nothing. That's how Nigerian business still is. Now, so this was the nature of what people refer to today as federalism. This competition between the regions, and the power is passed downwards. More the principle of subsidiarity, power was closer to the people. So when the military took over, a natural nature of military structure meant the centralization of authority. In that centralization of authority, oil producing revenues made your tax inconsequential for those who govern. In the civilian era before, everything was driven by taxes. People like me who grew up, here in Lagos, Mushi was like the demarcation between the Western region and the Federal Territory. If they're chasing you for tax in the Western region, you will run and find a way of escaping into Mushi, and you're free and kind of, the army didn't need to collect your tax anymore with oil revenues. So they didn't bother you with taxes, you didn't bother them with what they did with oil money. That was when the decline began in terms of economic planning and implementation. Yes, of course, there were some gains with revenues being pushed into massive infrastructure development and later. But the bottom line was that that structure of how decisions were made created a problem with how we manage the economy. Well, long and short of it, we got into a structural logjam, which it took the political sagacity, let's call it that, of a general economic Babangida to solve. I mean, people go after him for other things, but enough study has not been done of how his political cleverness saved the Nigerian economy. Because all our Marxist friends, all the university lecturers, have to be Marxists to be taken on to be authentic. They talk the economy into a position where basically lines of credit were being shut down on Nigerian banks, like foreign banks, who couldn't pay due debts and stuff like that. We were in debt. It then took the work done under President Babangida to begin to create markets. One of the most important markets that we created was the foreign exchange market. It was not an easy thing. It went first to a two-tier foreign exchange market called sphere. Then eventually it liberalized enough. And this market facilitated commerce. Now that was the foreign exchange market. Now we come to 2015. And we begin to play these funny games. The result is where the foreign exchange market is here today. So I think it's important to understand the place of institutions in economic performance. I would say that 90% of my academic work has been around institutions and economic performance. I wrote a book titled Managing Uncertainty, Competition and Strategy in Emerging Economies far back in the mid-90s. And the essential point of that is the nature of institutions and how they evolved. Of course, the biggest influence on my work is a gentleman called Douglas North, whose work on institutions and economic performance remains for me perhaps one of the best, as done even the Nobel Prize in Economics, of course, for his work. What we do not seem to understand is that the things that happened in the early years of the Buhari administration regarding multiple exchange rates and all of that fractured the institution of markets. The consequence is what we're hearing today. So I say this so that we can learn where the problems are coming from. It's not because this guy is a bad guy, that guy. They just did not understand enough what ultimately the consequence would be of that conduct.